Portside Inn crouched on the edge of the harbour like a tired old sailor, its beams blackened by decades of salt wind, its windows blurred by brine and time. The sign outside creaked with each gust, the painted letters so faded you had to know what they said to read them. Beyond the threshold the light was syrupy amber, carrying wood smoke, salt, and the faint bitterness of old ale. Outside the world was grey and unkind. Inside clocks ticked slow, and the rooms remembered kindness better than people did. I had come to the Portside Inn first as a traveller who needed a night shelter from the weather, and then again as someone who discovered the weather inside me was worse. I never introduced myself, nobody asked. That's how it worked here. If you needed to be known, you said so. If you needed to be invisible, the inn could do that too. Over time I learned the floorboards by their voices, the hearth by its temper, the innkeeper's mood by the way he wiped glass. I learned the patrons by their silences. That was how I came to be a sort of tide within this place, arriving with evening, leaving at dawn, lapping against the edges of other lives and drawing back, pulling a little of their driftwood with me. The first to arrive most evenings was Marlowe, the cartographer. He had a way of entering as if the door were heavier for him than for other travellers, as though every map in his satchel added weight to his bones. He'd pick the table by the window and unroll a sheet of vellum, careful as a priest with a relic. His maps were handsome things, the ink once brilliant, now softened by salt and touch. But the world had shifted under them. A harbour marked with a proud circle had burned and become only a satellite of ash. A peninsula had hopelessly eroded. A city was swallowed by a flood nobody had believed possible. Marlowe's hand hovered at the edges of these inaccuracies. I watched him add faint ticks in pencil where the coast had retreated, ghostly parentheses around ports that no longer welcomed ships. Each mark was a letting go. "Sea's eaten half our names," he told me once, not looking up. "The rest we gave away ourselves." I asked him why he kept at it, mapping a world that wouldn't stay still. He all but smiled. "Because the living must keep pointing. We can be wrong. We must still point." After Marlowe came Elise. She wore the same brown coat in all seasons, its lining restitched with thread that never matched its cuffs, polished smooth with worry. She sat near the door and ordered tea with milk if we had it, lemon if we didn't. Her satchel sat at her boots, heavy with letters bound in a green ribbon, notebooks filled with lists and tiny sketches of rooftops and hands, and a moss-colored scarf she never wore. She watched the door the way a lighthouse watches a horizon. Sometimes she faced it squarely, sometimes she angled her chair to pretend she wasn't waiting. "Expecting someone?" I asked once, soft as I could. She lifted her cup and found courage at the bottom. "I'm practicing," she said. "For what?" "For the moment when the person who walks in is not the one I lost, and I choose to be glad anyway." She always paid with exact coins, counting them twice. Sometimes she left me one extra, which I slipped back into her palm. We performed this ritual as carefully as two people handling an egg. The effect was the same. Something fragile remained unbroken. At the hearth sat Captain Brig. Whether his ship was truly named the Seafire, I cannot say, but his story burned just the same each night. He had a broken knuckle that made his hand sit like a question mark around his mug. His eyes were pale and watery, not from drink, but from too much squinting into distances. The tale was constant, an unmarked storm shouldering up from the south, the swell rising like a city. the masts cracking like thin bones. His voice roughened at the same places. The crew's names did not change, which comforted me. People in the world were always being renamed: refugee, deserter, liability. But in his story, the men were the men, and they always answered the roll call. "Why do you tell it again?" I asked him once between verses. He poked the fire with a length of driftwood. Sparks rose like fireflies that had heard the wrong story about their season. "Because it keeps them on the map," he said, nodding toward Marlowe without looking, "and because the boy always hears it for the first time." The boy, though he insisted aggressively he was a man, was a dockhand whose name was Finn, or maybe Tom, or maybe neither. I never quite trusted the way he offered it. He was all elbows and stubborn jaw, his coat too thin for winter and too warm for summer. His hands were cracked like shore stones. He counted his sips as though drink were a rope ladder, and he meant to climb but not too high. "What did the sea say to you today?" I asked him once, because I had found that people answer better when you assume they already have one. He gave me a sideways glance, then the kind of grin that was ashamed of itself. "She said I am not invited," he replied, surprised at his own answer, and took a careful swallow. That night he stood to leave and turned back twice, not for anything he'd forgotten, but to prove to himself he could leave a place that was not yet finished with him. Near the bar, the two merchants unfolded a battered ledger, like a map of old sins. Helvik and Sora, they called each other, though I suspected those were names only for the purpose of doing business without consequence. Their numbers tightened and loosened like a fishing net. They had one run left in them. They insisted, one final shipment before the roads, already bad, became too dangerous. "It's the northern route," Helvik said, tapping the page where a sum sat like a dare. "3 bridges still standing if the rains hold." "If," Sora said. Her hair was neatly braided, her coat neat even where it had been mended. That little word has eaten us before. They studied Marlowe's maps through the corner of their eyes, but never asked him directly, as if knowledge had become contraband. On nights when the fog came in thick as fleece and wrapped the inn in secrecy, I heard them practicing the story they would tell if they returned, and then the story they would tell if they did not, as if a lie could be chosen in advance like a suit of clothes. There were others, as there always are in a place that learns to make room. A midwife named Rune, who had delivered babies on kitchen tables and in the back of a fishmonger's stall, and once in a rowboat when the mother insisted on hearing the oarlocks cluck while she groaned. Rune kept her hands folded on the table as if they might run away and save someone without her. "Life chooses its own windows," she said to me with a broker's shrug. "Sometimes it climbs in sideways." On a coal-colored night, when the rain met the sea in a quarrel, a lighthouse keeper arrived, trailing salt and a faint halo of damp about him. "Cass," he said, and nothing else for an hour. He sat where he could see both the door and the hearth, and when he finally spoke it was to say, "They've asked for darkness." He meant the city council, keen to save money, keen to sell more shoreline to more speculators. "We'll go 6 nights without a lamp. Even churches are shuttered midweek now. Prayers work only in bulk." "Keepers keep," Rune told him, putting a slice of brown bread on his plate. "Do your own lighting." He stared at the bread as though it might strike a bargain with him. Later, when he slept sitting up in the chair, I saw the flame inside him gutter and catch, gutter and catch. A violinist came on a day when the wind hummed in the shutters and the fish market closed early. Her case was strapped with a web of twine, and her dress had once belonged to someone who danced in brighter rooms. She offered to play for a meal. The innkeeper weighed it in the conservative scale he kept, where customers couldn't see it, then nodded. She played a waltz that remembered how laughter sounded, and the room remembered too. Even Helvig's fingers tapped. Elise forgot to watch the door for 3 minutes. The violinist stayed 2 nights, then left before breakfast, not stealing anything but the portion of sorrow she had earned. A courier came with letters. He carried them in a tin box strapped to his chest, as if they were medicine. The letters were from cities upriver, where the quarantine posts had grown too permanent to be called temporary. Most of them were borders of black ink, enclosing small, fierce handwriting that seemed to believe in itself. He laid them out on the bar, and people came to claim the names, or names they knew, or names they wished they knew. Elise did not look for one. I watched her choose not to. The innkeeper's wife found a letter for a neighbor who had not come into town for months, then held it like a bird that would not fly from her hand, unsure whether to be glad or sorry. By this point in the evening, the inn had warmed into itself, the windows fogged with breath and steam and the argument between the brass kettle and the lid. The floorboards chimed, 1 at the threshold, 2 by the hearth, 3 in the back hall, and you could hear people when their thoughts got heavier than their cups. A river of minor kindnesses flowed. Somebody tucked a scarf around a sleeper's shoulders. Someone else set a second mug near a person who had been nursing the first too slowly to finish. Rune showed a fisherman how to tie a square knot one-handed, because his other had stiffened with age. It was a strange truth in a dreary world. Small mercies were more radical than plans. In that river, conversations braided and unbraided. Marlowe, asked by nobody, leaned toward the merchant's ledger. "That northern bridge by the lime kiln," he said without preamble, "is only a rumor now, unless you cross at dawn." Sora's mouth tightened with suspicion, but her eyes moved the way eyes do when the mind is already crossing. "I don't pay for rumors," she said. "You will if you live by them," Marlowe replied, turning back to his map as if he had never spoken. Elise and the dockhand, Finn or Tom or neither, found themselves shoulder to shoulder at the bar when the violinist paused for breath. He pressed his palm flat against the wood and watched it lift with the music. "What happens when you stop waiting?" he asked no one. Elise answered anyway. "You relearn walking," she said, "but you limp a while." "Then why keep your chair by the door?" "Because when you stop waiting, you don't stop wanting, and because sometimes the same posture serves both." He laughed, short and surprised. It sounded like a fish breaking the surface, astonished to learn about air. Captain Brigg told his storm again. Finn listened again for the first time. This time, near the end, the captain added a line I had never heard him say. "We set our signal lantern too late, but not too late to learn something." "What's that?" Finn asked, leaning in, mouth open like a drawer. "That you can still be brave after the moment you think bravery would have mattered most," Briggs said, "and that counts more often than you'd think." Finn folded the words awkwardly and put them somewhere inside his coat. Outside, the rain gave up its argument and lay sulking on the cobbles. Fog took the harbour the way a careful thief takes a room. First the edges, then the centre, then the corners, where you kept your most private shape. Cass, the lighthouse keeper, stood and went to the window as if the view belonged to him, the way sorrow belongs to the experienced. "If they order the lamp dark," he said to his reflection. "I'll keep my kettle on full boil." "You'll drink them safe?" Rune asked. "I'll whistle the steam," he said, "and men who know my song will steer by it." The violinist began a tune so soft it stitched the drift of conversations into a single seam. I carried bowls and plates, collected empties, fetched coal from the scuttle. The innkeeper's wife showed me the chapped valley between her thumb and finger, where kettles leave their mark. She said the trick was to bend the wrist, not the back. She said the trick was to keep the door from banging even when the wind wanted you to. She said the trick was a dozen tricks, and none of them were the one you needed, and you learned anyway. Then the door opened to the kind of cold that brings news just by entering. A man filled the frame, one shoulder higher than the other, his coat gleaming with rain like a seal's back. He carried a wooden box with brass corners and set it on the floor as carefully as a man sets down a promise he means to keep, but cannot quite bear the weight of yet. He did not give a name. He asked for hot soup and a place near the fire. People made room on both sides. "What have you got in the box?" Finn asked, already picturing treasure or tricks. "An instrument," the man said. "A violin?" the violinist asked, interested as if she'd discovered a cousin at a distant table. "A barometer," he said, apologetic. "I measure pressure. I listen to what the air is about to say." We laughed in the way people laugh when they envy a person's profession. It sounded like mockery, but meant respect. He ate his soup without comment and warmed his hands around the bowl when he was finished, as if he might hear things in the steam. Later, when the night leaned heavier, he cracked the lid of the box and frowned. "What does it tell you?" Marlowe asked, showing the patient anxiety of someone who long ago learned he cannot change the wind, but is obliged to know what it is doing. "That the wind will pretend to be generous at dawn," the barometer man said, "and then pull her gift back. Hard." The merchant's faces shifted almost imperceptibly in the same direction, the way stalks of wheat tilt together in a sudden draft. Elise glanced at the door again, then at her satchel, then at her hands. The innkeeper set another log on the fire in a way that suggested he recognized a piece of choreography he danced too many times, the moment when caution and hunger started wrestling in the heads of his patrons. Helvig stood and scraped his chair back. The sound had the wrong sharpness for the room. "We leave on the northern road at first light," he announced to Sora, but also to anyone who could be made into a temporary crew. "We'll pay fare and in advance." "Never in advance," Sora corrected, glaring. He switched to the softer voice of a man courting his own plan. "Half on the hoof, half on the return." Finn glanced at Brigg, whose chin tilted in a sailor's shrug that meant both. "You will do what you've already decided, and I will be here when you tell me how it felt." "I can walk a wagon," Finn said, the hard corners of his youth rearranging into purpose. "I can swim a rope. I can carry." "You can listen?" Sora asked. She meant to her, to danger, to the kind of silence that means stop. He nodded. The bargain slipped between them like a fish willing to be caught this once. Elise asked the innkeeper for paper. He brought a blank receipt and a stub of pencil. She wrote quickly, folded the sheet into a triangle, sealed it with a smear of candle wax and handed it to the courier. "If you pass the watch hut at the miller's ford," she said, "leave this under the stone by the wheel track." "Who's it for?" the courier asked, automatically, out of habit, and because the world demands answers even when it doesn't deserve them. "It's for me," she said, and smiled like a person testing a word she hopes will fit. Marlowe shaded a line on his map as if the road would be safer if he acknowledged it. He had never believed that, but he had learned to act as if it were useful. If you go before dawn, he told Helvig and Sora, stop where the road buckles near the alder. The frost keeps its last strength there. Men breathe too loud in that bend. Sora frowned. How do you know this? Because I am wrong often enough to remember the times I was right, Marlowe said, not proud. And because someone wrote me once about that bend. He tapped his map, then his chest, as though both were documents that changed in the night. The inn thinned in its talking as the night thickened, that hour when even true things feel like rumor. Cass, the lighthouse keeper, slept with his eyes barely open, terror of a man who expects a shout. Rune knit uselessly, for the pleasure of the gentle arithmetic of it. The barometer man polished his brass corners because there are only so many ways to say, I cannot keep you safe, without saying it directly. The violinist, too tired to play, ran resin over the bow hair as one might pet a loyal animal. Briggs stood and stretched and let his coat fall off his shoulders, the sail of a ship lowering at last. I went to refill Elise's cup and found it already full, though I hadn't touched it. She looked at me with a mild surprise, as if I had read her hunger in advance. You always remember to warm the mug, she said. It's easier to keep heat than to make it, I said, which was one of those sentences that sounded like I meant something more general than tea. She touched the rim as if memorizing that truth physically. Sometimes I sit outside after I leave here, she said, not looking at me, and count the seconds between the bell and the echo. It's different every night, even the same bell. I suppose that means the air is different, or I am. Both, I said, but mostly the air, because it is kind to blame small things on physics. She smiled into her cup. And large things? We call those weather, I answered, and move our chairs and pretend we are strategists. At some hour that is only numbered by people who have an appointment with sorrow, the door opened again. A woman stood there, soaked and straight-backed, her mouth pressed into a line that suggested she had set it that way to prevent something else from escaping. Behind her, a little boy clung to her skirt, a bundle of bones and stubbornness. Rooms? She asked, ready to argue. 2, the innkeeper said gently, and stew. The boy stared at the hearth as though it were a new species. Name? The innkeeper's wife asked, not for the ledger so much as for the human ceremony that puts people back into sequence. Lena, the woman answered, and this is Evo. From where? Rune asked, already making little calculations only a midwife knows, hunger and bone growth and the way a child's eyes sit in his face. From there, Lena said, thumb hitching toward the part of the world we were all from, which was now called elsewhere and also formerly. She didn't want to say more. That was all right. The inn didn't require more. The boy took his stew in both hands and ate with the relief of someone who grew up on promises. He had a tin soldier in his pocket, the paint worn to ideas. He set it on the table and stood the spoon beside it like a marching staff. He made it circle the bowl and collapse. He made it get back up again. It always does, he told me with authority, surprising himself with a grin that made Rune's eyes go soft as cloth. Of course, I said, setting another slice of bread near him. Soldiers are very stubborn about standing. Lena looked up at that and nodded in a way that meant, thank you for not pitying us out loud. In the back hall, I heard the groan of the water pump, and then the innkeeper's laugh when the pipe shuddered and coughed. He laughed at springs the same way he laughed at animals, like he recognized a fellow worker who sometimes chose not to work. I pictured the boarders in their narrow rooms above us, each with their suitcase or bundle under the bed, because nobody believed a lock meant forever. Dreams in the inn were communal. Nobody confessed them, but we all carried their weight the next day, slightly stooped. Sometime in that deep fold of night, the weather changed. You can hear it if you've learned how to listen. The fog stopped being romantic and became an influence. The harbour shifted its shoulders. Cass woke without waking and said, "Ah," in the voice of a man to whom the sea writes daily, even when there is no mail. The barometer man's box ticked in a way that was not a sound but a decision. The merchant's ledger looked suddenly like a prayer book, but nobody turned it over. The violinist, who had been dozing upright, tuned her strings and played something new. It was neither cheerful nor tragic. It was the sort of music that holds a door and lets you decide whether to walk through. Elise laid her hand on her satchel and did not move it. Finn tightened the laces on his boots. Captain Brigg closed his eyes and mouthed the crew's names like a rosary. Marlowe rolled his map and tied it off, not because he was finished, but because at some point the act of closing becomes the first act of going. I went out the back to fetch more kindling and found the alley white with breath. The sky over the harbour was the colour of a promise someone had told too many times. The wind had learned to whistle through new gaps in the eaves. When I came back, the inn smelled like cinnamon, the innkeeper's wife's way of convincing morning to be sweet. "Dawn," she said, as if it could be summoned like a customer. "Something like it," I said. Helvig buckled his pack. Sora folded the ledger with an almost ceremonial neatness, then slid it into her coat as if deep pockets could keep plans stable. Finn looked to them, then to Brigg, then to me, which made me smile for reasons I did not have time to investigate. "You can still change your mind," I told him, "because someone should always say it at least once." "I already did," he replied, and shouldered the other end of a strap. The barometer man snapped his lid closed and stood as if called. Cass buttoned his coat up to his throat, stubbornly tidy, the way a man goes to face a committee he despises but will respect. Rune kissed her fingers and touched the lintel, the way women who have delivered babies touch doorways, because a threshold recognizes its own. Elise finished her tea and stood with the compact grace of a person who carries fear folded small and perfectly in her chest. She put coins on the table and then an extra one, and I somehow returned it to her without insulting the economy we had carefully built. She tucked it into her sleeve with the care of a woman who knows money is also talisman. "Will you be back?" I asked, though I had promised myself I would not ask questions shaped like leashes. She gave me a look that was half apology and half blessing. "If not," she said, "someone will come who needs the chair by the door more than I do. Keep it warm." "I always do," I said, and meant the cup and the posture and everything in between. We filed toward the door with a quiet that reminded me of church and also of boarding a lifeboat. The innkeeper snapped the latch up and then caught it with his palm so it wouldn't bang, the neat little magic trick that keeps a morning from beginning with regret. The wind rushed in, smelling of iron and wet wood and a rumour of sun. The harbour huddled in its own slight warmth, the boat's black vowels against the pewter grammar of the sea. Helvig and Sora went first. their boots striking a steady rhythm, a sentence in search of a period. Finn fell in behind them without looking back. Cass headed toward the lighthouse like a man walking into a job interview with the elements. The barometer man lifted his box and nodded at no one and everybody. Rune turned down the lane that held the midwifery bag of a city. Briggs stood in the doorway and let the wind collect around him, his story rising invisible from his shoulders like smoke. Marlowe stayed, and I thought perhaps he would. He unfolded his map again and set his pencil point at the edge of a coast that had betrayed him. "I'll redraw the headland," he said to himself. "There's no kindness in insisting on the old line." "You could leave the old line," I said, surprising myself, "as a remembrance." He looked at me then with a teacher's patience. "Remembrance is for the names. The land gets the truth." I wanted to ask where he put the truth when it hurt, but the answer was everywhere around us, wasn't it? We put it in rooms that smelled like cinnamon and soap. We put it in ledgers and letters and the wrong songs played at the right times. We put it in the chair by the door so a person could sit and practice. Elise paused just outside and turned her face up into the wind, the way some people face a photograph of someone they miss. She closed her eyes, then opened them and stepped off the stoop. I thought of the triangle of paper in the courier's tin box, waiting for a stone at a wheel track. I thought of the soldier in Evo's pocket, marching, falling, marching. I thought of Cass's kettle singing to ships. Because who's to say a sound cannot keep a man from rocks? I thought of Briggs' storm and the way he kept those names on the map. I thought of Marlowe and the faint pencil marks that looked like grief shaped into purpose. I stayed to bank the fire. The innkeeper's wife went upstairs to strip sheets and lay out fresh ones and lecture the pillows into fluffing. The innkeeper stood at the door and looked out at the harbour in a way that had no hope or despair in it, only arithmetic. He counted weather and boats and the number of eggs in the kitchen and whether his hands would allow him to lift the kegs before noon. He rubbed his thumb and forefinger together the way he did when thinking, feeling the remembered heat of the kettles. "Another day," he said. Not to me, but to the planks and the coals and the room itself. "Another day," I echoed, to the same. By mid-morning, new people would arrive. A woman who carved birds from driftwood. A man with a case of spectacles and the wrong prescription for everybody. Two sisters who spoke only to each other until someone mentioned soup. The inn's ledger would grow a line longer. The chair by the door would gather a new body's shiver. The floorboards would remark upon each step. The kettle would complain and then deliver. Small mercies would petition, get denied, petition again. I cleaned the mugs and found the lip marks Elise had left, twin parentheses of a person who intended to stop there and did. I rinsed them gently, not to erase her, but to give the next person the illusion of being first. I wiped the table where the barometer man had rested his box and thought of pressure on one square of wood, how everything leaves its measure if you know how to read it. I stacked bowls and hummed the violinist's tune, which I could not repeat with accuracy, only with goodwill. Toward noon, a shaft of sunlight thumbed the window and then changed its mind. The sky tried on blue and decided not to leave the house. The tide sighed and took back a few stones it had loaned to the shoreline. I went to the stoop to shake a rug and saw, far up the lane, Finn's coat like a punctuation mark at the end of the merchant's sentence. Past them, on the headland, A small figure climbed the lighthouse steps, Cass, taking the stairs as if each one had made a personal enemy of him. In the opposite direction, a courier on a bicycle rattled over the cobbles, his tin box a heartbeat strapped to his chest. Behind me, the innkeeper's wife began to sing to the linens, a lullaby meant for houses. The inn listened. It had learned to listen long before any of us. Its beams had a memory for hands, for laughter, for the weight of rain-heavy coats. Its windows kept a careful record of every face that had pressed close to see what weather meant to them personally. The Portside Inn was not alive, not in the way people are, but it remembered as well as anyone, and sometimes better. When evening came again, the sign creaked with a gust that sounded like the throat-clearing of a complicated story. The door opened for a man with fish scales on his sleeves, and a girl whose freckles had found each other and become constellations. A teacher from the inland arrived, with the mild, desperate manner of a person who has taught too many lessons about caution and not enough about joy. A magistrate with mud on his cuffs argued with a ghost only he could see. The chair by the door found new occupation. The hearth regained its republic. I took up my place between their breaths and the kettle's voice and learned the new names the way one learns a coastline, with respect for error, with gratitude for remnant accuracy. Marlowe came in late, wet around the edges. He shook rain from his hat and laid his map flat like a child going to sleep. He did not look at me when he said, almost shy, "I found a place where the headland holds." "Then mark it," I said, feeling absurdly proud, as though the land had obeyed my suggestion. He lifted his pencil and hesitated. "Perhaps I'll leave it blank," he murmured. "It's nice to have one thing known that we refuse to make into proof." Elise did not come that night. The chair by the door kept her shape for a while. People often leave the outline of their waiting behind for a day or two. Finn did not come either, but a boy with a new rope burn on his wrist stood in the dockhand's place and drank with careful gulps. Captain Brigg told his story to a table of strangers, and when he reached the part where the signal lantern swung, he looked towards the door as if expecting a boy to ask a question. None did. He finished anyway and touched the knuckle that made his hand into a prayer. Cass came at last, damp and defiant, his hair smelling of sea fire. "I lit it," he said without preamble, wicked joy skittering through his words. "I lit the kettle and the lamp and everything that holds a flame. Let them count the coins somewhere else." "Who came in?" I asked, leafing through my short list of those who might be saved by disobedience. "A boat with a cracked spine," he said, "and a man who knows to thank a whistle. The sea gave him back because I argued well. The barometer man, who had stayed one extra day to see if his instrument would be right, raised his mug without looking up. The pressure fell," he said. "It had to yield to something." The violinist did not return, but someone at the back table picked up the bow she had left behind and drew it across the strings once, surprised by the voice that emerged. In that note, the room changed its mind about the evening. The magistrate stopped arguing. The teacher unclenched his jaw. The girl with the constellations laughed, and then looked embarrassed, and then laughed again, rediscovering how it felt to like the sound you made by accident. Day followed night, followed day. Some names repeated, some did not. The chair by the door was sometimes empty, sometimes inhabited by the shape of a decision. Letters arrived and were not delivered. Letters were delivered and were not read. Maps were drawn, and then drawn again until the act of drawing itself became a kind of prayer. The stew thickened and thinned with prosperity. A crate of lemons came once in winter, and everybody smelled them, the room going quiet with astonishment at that color, that proof that somewhere the sun was behaving itself. The lemons lasted longer as story than as fruit. And what of me? I ladled stew and wiped tables and learned how to keep a room warm without overheating, which is a kind of diplomacy. I listened and carried and remembered. Sometimes a patron would ask, "How long have you been here?" as if the answer would explain something they had felt but couldn't name. I would say long enough. They'd nod as if that were a year. What I meant was, long enough to know who sits where when they mean to leave, and who sits where when they mean to stay. Long enough to recognize the way a person's shoulders make a vow before their mouth decides. Long enough to love a room without believing it can save anyone from weather. Once, not long after a thaw that left the street slick with vanity, Elise returned. She came in with the hour and the habit of someone who had found another inn and seen that it was not this one. She took her chair by the door and set her satchel down more lightly than before. I poured her tea and warmed the mug. She smiled at the steam as if she had commissioned it. "Did you leave your letter?" I asked. "I did," she said. "And did you go back to look under the stone?" "I did," she said, and took a sip. "Was there an answer?" She cupped the mug in both hands. "There was a small white shell," she said softly. "Nothing else. I imagined the road. I imagined a wheel track and a flat stone and the small curved constellation of something the sea makes without noticing. I thought of Elise choosing whether to be disappointed or charmed. I decided I preferred a world where she was charmed. What did it say?" I asked. "That I had arrived somewhere, even if not at the place I had meant to go," she said. "That someone was listening who spoke shell. That I am not the only person who leaves impossibly small answers." We were quiet for a time, then she said, "I think I will write a letter to the person who put the shell there. I'll tell them I'm practicing being glad for the wrong messenger." "You'll make an excellent correspondent," I said. She smiled. "So will you. You reply in tea." Helvig and Sora returned weeks later without Finn and with a story that did not quite match their faces. They insisted the bridges had held and that the ledger would be honest again. They insisted the road had been braver than people. Sora slid an envelope across the bar addressed to "Who Trains the Boy?" Captain Brigg opened it with his rough knuckles and found inside a single word: "Stubborn." He read it twice and then breathed out like a man who has found the answer to a question he meant to save for later. "Where is he?" he asked. "North," Sora said, and did not elaborate in a way that felt like respect and not secrecy. "Carrying." Marlowe's maps became palimpsests, layer over layer, pencil and ink, coastlines that had learned to admit their stutters. A magistrate who returned often asked him to copy one. "For the courthouse," the magistrate said, unconvincing but earnest. Marlowe made a copy and left the headland blank the way he had promised. "I prefer a place untouched by certainty," the magistrate muttered, then tucked the map under his arm like a fragile law. Cass kept lighting. He paid the fine when he could, and did not when he couldn't. When a boat scrapes home against the rocks that would have eaten it, even councils learn to be embarrassed. The kettle whistled more and more as if it were proud to be a lighthouse in its way. Sometimes late, when the inn was empty of everyone but chairs, Cass would put the kettle on our hearth and let it sing. We learned to hear the difference between a signal for ships and a song for rooms. Rune moved through the city like a rumor of mercy. She came in with a stain on her skirt that could have been stew or could have been blood, and we never asked. She sat and counted breaths in 2s and 3s and then knit until the pattern told her a story about a mother who could not stop shivering or a baby who arrived with a look of grave incomprehension. She slept sometimes, upright, her head nodding to a beat only she could hear, the drum of life continuing without applause. And I stayed. I learned that the world could be dreary and still full of concentrated sweetness that refuses to be generalized. I learned that some people wait at doors because there are doors worth waiting at. I learned the names of storms and the new names of old streets, and the sound an apology makes when it has had to cross a great distance. I learned to measure a day, not by how much was fixed, but by how much was kept from breaking. On the night I decide to write this down, the wind is quiet. Not forgiving, not idle, just quiet, as if even it needs to sit a while. The inn is half full. Marlowe has left a pencil line trailing into blankness that pleases him. Elise has written a letter that says only, "I am practicing," and sealed it without an address. Captain Brigg is humming to the fire. Cass is staring at his hands, finding in their calluses the proof that light can be made by labor. The barometer men's box is shut and used as a footstool by a woman who has walked too far today. Rune is telling Ivo how to fold paper into a ship, and he is letting her because he has learned that adults need to teach you things to stay standing. Helvig and Sora are balancing 2 mugs on a ledger, as if the scales of their profession could be convinced to hold something warm. The violinist's bow is on the mantel, like a promise of sound. The innkeeper's wife is scolding a towel for not drying quickly enough, and the towel is apologizing by being at least honest about its dampness. The floorboards sing their usual notes when the door opens and a new person enters, and all of us adjust our posture to make room without admitting we are doing anything of the kind. The Portside Inn remains as it was, a pause button in a world that prefers face forward, a lamp in a city testing the price of darkness, a set of hands learning the trick of warmth. People come to rest in a dreary world. They leave with a coal in the pocket, the smallest ember of a particular fire, enough to get them to the next harbour, the next chair, the next necessary map. Outside the sea keeps its counsel, inside we keep each other's. And if you ask me what I am called, who it is that watches and carries and remembers, I might tell you a name, or I might point to a chair, a kettle, a ledger, a map, because the inn remembers more honestly than I do, and it will be here tonight and the next to take your measure, to set your cup down where the steam will kiss your face, to let you practice being glad for whatever messenger walks through the door.